The rain hammered against the tall windows of the Memorial Hospital's private wing, creating rivers of water that distorted the city lights beyond. Inside room 407, the most expensive suite the hospital had to offer, an old man lay motionless in his bed. His name was Harold, and at 83 years old, he had built an empire that spanned 3 continents. His wealth was the kind that appeared in Forbes magazines and sparked endless speculation on financial news channels. Yet here he was, seemingly helpless, his frail body connected to machines that beeped rhythmically in the quiet room. Harold's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and steady. To anyone who entered the room, he appeared to be sleeping deeply, perhaps even unconscious. The doctors had explained to his family that at his age, recovery from the stroke he'd suffered would be slow and uncertain. They spoke in hushed tones about brain function and motor skills, about patience and realistic expectations. His 3 children had listened with varying degrees of concern etched on their faces. But Harold wasn't sleeping, not really. He had discovered, quite by accident 3 days after his stroke, that he could control his awareness even when his body refused to cooperate fully. The stroke had left him weak, unable to speak clearly, but his mind remained sharp as ever. Perhaps sharper because now he had nothing to do but observe and listen. And what he had observed in the past 2 weeks had fundamentally changed how he viewed the people closest to him. His eldest son, Richard, had visited that morning. Richard was 55, with silver hair that he paid a premium to keep perfectly styled, and a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He had stood at the foot of Harold's bed for exactly 7 minutes, checking his platinum watch 3 times during that span. "Well, father," Richard had said, his voice carrying that peculiar tone people use when they think they're talking to someone who can't hear them. "The doctors say you might not wake up. I want you to know that I'll take care of everything. The company will be in good hands, my hands." Through his barely open eyelids, Harold had watched his son's face. There was no grief there, no sadness. Just a calculating expression, the same one Richard wore during board meetings when he was about to make a move against a competitor. Richard had pulled out his phone and made a call right there in the room. "Yes, it's me," Richard had said, turning away from the bed. "He's not going to make it. Start preparing the paperwork for the transfer of controlling shares. We need to move quickly before anyone contests it." Harold had felt something crack inside his chest, and it wasn't his failing heart. It was the last fragment of hope he'd held that his eldest son cared about him as anything more than an obstacle to wealth and power. His daughter had come in the afternoon. She was 48, beautiful in the way that expensive cosmetic procedures and personal trainers could achieve. She had sat beside his bed, holding his hand, and for a moment, Harold had felt a warmth in his chest, perhaps still cared. "Oh, Daddy," she had whispered, and Harold had strained to hear genuine emotion in her voice. "I'm so sorry this happened to you. You know I love you, right? I always have." She had paused, squeezing his hand gently. Then she had continued, and the warmth in Harold's chest turned to ice. "I know you never approved of, but he's changed, Daddy. He really has. And with you gone, there won't be anyone to stop us from accessing my trust fund early. Has this amazing investment opportunity, Daddy. It's going to make us so much money. I just need about 20 million to start." She had sat there for another 10 minutes, talking about her husband, a man Harold had investigated thoroughly and found to be nothing more than a sophisticated con artist with good looks and better lies. Had never listened when Harold tried to warn her. Now she sat beside what she believed was her dying father's bedside, planning how to spend her inheritance. Harold's youngest son, David, had visited in the evening. At 42, David was the baby of the family, though he hardly acted like it anymore. He had barely made it through the door before his phone rang. He'd answered it immediately, his voice carrying across the room. "Yeah, I'm at the hospital. No, he's out cold, probably won't even know I was here." David had laughed at something the person on the other end said. "Dude, I know. As soon as he kicks it, I'm buying that yacht. The 70-footer, maybe the 80-footer. Why not, right? It's not like the old man can take it with him." David had stayed for less than 5 minutes before claiming he had dinner reservations he couldn't miss. He'd patted Harold's shoulder once, absently, the way someone might pet a dog they weren't particularly fond of, and then he was gone. Harold had lain there in the gathering darkness of his hospital room, machines beeping their steady rhythm, and wondered how he had failed so completely as a father. He had given them everything, hadn't he? The best schools, unlimited resources, every opportunity. He had built his empire partly for himself, yes, but also for them, to give them a foundation, a legacy. Instead, he had created 3 people who saw him only as an obstacle between themselves and his money. That night, as Harold lay in his bed pretending to sleep, he had made a decision. If he survived this, if he recovered enough to reclaim his life, things would change. He would change them. But he needed to know more. He needed to see who else in his life cared about Harold the man versus Harold the billionaire. The night nurse had come in to check his vitals. Her name was Sophie, and she was young, probably in her late 20s. She had kind eyes and gentle hands, and she always spoke to him as if he could hear her, even when his own children treated him like he was already in his grave. "Good evening, mister," Sophie had said softly, checking the IV drip and adjusting his blankets. "How are we doing tonight? I hope you had some nice visitors today." She had gone about her work efficiently but carefully, never rough, never rushed. As she was about to leave, she had paused by his bedside and done something unexpected. She had pulled a small book from her pocket and sat down in the chair beside his bed. "I hope you don't mind, mister," she had said quietly. "I like to read to my patients sometimes. Studies show that even when people are unconscious, they can sometimes hear and understand. My grandmother was in a coma once, and we read to her every day. She said later that she could hear us, that it helped her hold on." For the next 20 minutes, Sophie had read from a book of poetry. Her voice was soothing, and she chose beautiful pieces about nature and hope and resilience. Harold had felt tears forming in the corners of his eyes, grateful that they could be explained away as involuntary if anyone noticed. Here was someone who didn't know him, who had nothing to gain from his recovery or his death, treating him with more genuine care than his own children had shown. When Sophie had finished and left the room, Harold had allowed himself to truly feel the depth of his loneliness. He had built an empire, conquered markets, created wealth that would outlast several generations. But he had failed to build the one thing that mattered, a family that loved him for who he was, not what he had. The next morning brought someone Harold hadn't expected to see. Walked into his room at precisely 8 o'clock, carrying a thermos and a newspaper. Had been Harold's executive assistant for 37 years. She had started as a secretary fresh out of college when Harold's company was still small enough to fit in a single office building. Now she was 71 years old, officially retired for 5 years, and yet here she was. Harold watched through his barely open eyes as settled into the chair beside his bed with a familiarity that spoke of long acquaintance. She poured herself a cup of what smelled like green tea from her thermos and unfolded the newspaper. "Good morning, Harold," she said in her crisp, no-nonsense voice. She had been one of the few people in his life who had never called him Mr. or Sir, just Harold. "I thought you might like to hear what's happening in the world. The doctors say you might be able to hear even if you can't respond. Knowing you, that's probably driving you crazy." A slight smile played at the corners of her mouth, and Harold felt an absurd urge to smile back. Had always understood him better than most people. She had been there through his divorce from the children's mother, through every business crisis, through the death of his second wife 10 years ago. She had been his right hand, his sounding board, and perhaps his closest friend, though he had never actually said so out loud. Began reading him the financial news, her commentary sharp and insightful. She told him about movements in the stock market, about competitors making stupid decisions, about opportunities he would have jumped on if he were able. She treated him not as a dying old man, but as the formidable businessman he had been, and Harold felt more alive listening to her than he had in weeks. "Your children were here yesterday, I heard," said after a while, her voice carefully neutral. "Richard and David all made time in their busy schedules." There was something in her tone that made Harold pay close attention. Knew his children well. She had watched them grow up, had seen how Harold had struggled to connect with them after their mother had turned them against him during the divorce. She had never said anything directly critical, but Harold had always sensed her disapproval of how his children had turned out. "I also heard," continued, her voice dropping lower, "that Richard has already contacted the legal team about transferring controlling shares. He seems quite confident that you won't be waking up." Harold felt a surge of anger, and one of the machines beside his bed beeped slightly faster. Glanced at it, then back at Harold's face. Her eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Interesting," she murmured. "Harold, if you can hear me, if you're in there, you need to know something. Your children are planning to divide your empire among themselves the moment you're declared incompetent or deceased. They've already started positioning themselves with board members, making promises, forming alliances." She paused, sipping her tea, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. "I know you loved their mother. I know the divorce hurt you badly, and I know you tried your best with those children. But Harold, they're not good people. I'm sorry to say it so bluntly, but it's true. They're greedy and selfish, and they see you only as a means to an end. Harold wished desperately that he could speak, could tell that he knew, that he had seen the truth himself over the past weeks. The machine beeped faster again. Stood up and moved closer to the bed, studying Harold's face intently. "You can hear me, can't you?" she said quietly. "Your heart rate increases when I talk about certain things. Harold, if you're in there, if you're aware, you need to fight. You need to get better. Because if you don't, everything you built will be torn apart by people who don't appreciate it or understand it." She sat back down, and Harold heard her sigh deeply. "I'm going to tell you something I never told you before, Harold. Something I probably should have said years ago. You're a difficult man. You're stubborn and demanding and sometimes completely unreasonable. But you're also brilliant and principled and far more kind than you let anyone see. Working for you was the best decision I ever made. Not because of the money, though you paid me well, because you challenged me. You trusted me. You treated me as an equal when most men of your generation would have treated me as decorative furniture." His voice wavered slightly, and Harold realized with surprise that she was on the verge of tears. Who he had never seen cry in 37 years, not even when her own husband died. "I'm retired, Harold. I should be spending time with. A garden I should be tending. But I'm here because I care about you. Not your money, not your empire. You. The man who remembers that I like green tea, who always asked about my family, who gave my daughter a scholarship to MIT without ever telling me until she mentioned it years later." Harold felt his own tears threatening again. He had forgotten about that scholarship, but hadn't. She had remembered, had kept it close all these years. "So fight, Harold," said firmly, her composure returning. "Fight to come back, because I'm not ready to say goodbye to you yet, and I refuse to watch your children destroy what you built." She stayed for another hour, reading the news, talking about old times, sharing gossip about former colleagues. When she finally left, promising to return the next day, Harold felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: hope. That afternoon brought another unexpected visitor. Harold heard the door open and the click of expensive heels on the floor. A perfume he recognized filled the room, something floral and elegant. Then a voice he hadn't heard in over a decade spoke his name. "Hello, Harold." Elizabeth stood at the foot of his bed, looking exactly as he remembered her, though she must be nearly 70 now. She had aged gracefully, her silver hair styled elegantly, her posture straight and dignified. Elizabeth had been his once, long ago, before he married the children's mother. They had broken up over his single-minded focus on building his business, his inability to balance work and personal life. She had married someone else, had a good life from what Harold had heard. He hadn't seen her in years. "I heard about your stroke," Elizabeth said, moving to sit in the chair had vacated. "I know we haven't spoken in a long time, Harold, but I felt I should come. I hope you don't mind." She sat quietly for a moment, studying his face. "You look older," she said with a slight smile. "Though I suppose I do too. Time is relentless, isn't it?" Elizabeth reached out and took his hand, her touch warm and familiar in a way that made Harold's chest ache with old memories. "I've thought about you over the years, Harold, wondered how you were doing. I saw your name in the papers, of course, watched your empire grow. You did exactly what you said you would do. You built something extraordinary." Her thumb rubbed gently across his knuckles. "I married Robert, as you probably know. We had 42 good years together before he passed last year. 3 children, 7. A good life, Harold, a happy life." There was a pause, and when Elizabeth spoke again, her voice was softer. "But I often wondered what might have happened if I had been more patient with you back then. If I had understood that your drive to build something wasn't about choosing work over me, but about creating security, leaving a legacy. I was young and impatient. I wanted all of your attention, and I couldn't understand why that wasn't enough for you." Harold wished desperately that he could respond, could tell her that he had thought about her too, especially during his darkest times. That he had wondered if choosing to focus so completely on his business had been the right decision after all. "I heard your children were here," Elizabeth continued, and something in her tone shifted. "I know through charity work. She's on several boards I'm involved with." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. "Harold, I don't know if you can hear me, and I don't know if I should say this, but if you can hear me, you should know that talks about you. About how she wishes you would just let her access her trust fund, how unfair it is that you control her inheritance. She doesn't talk about you with love or concern, Harold. She talks about you like you're an obstacle." The machine beside Harold's bed began beeping faster, and Elizabeth glanced at it with concern. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't come here to upset you. I just thought you should know. You deserved better children than you got, Harold, better than what your ex-wife raised them to be." She stood up but didn't leave immediately. Instead, she leaned down and kissed Harold's forehead gently, the way she used to do when they were young and in love. "Goodbye, Harold. I hope you find peace whatever happens. You were a good man, even if you were terrible at showing it to the people who mattered most." After Elizabeth left, Harold lay in the gathering shadows of his room and took stock of what he had learned. His children were vultures, circling and waiting, was a true friend who had stood by him for nearly 4 decades. Elizabeth had moved on to a happy life, but still thought of him with more kindness than his own flesh and blood showed. The night brought Sophie again with her gentle hands and her poetry. Tonight she read Frost, and her voice soft in the quiet room. When she finished, she did something she hadn't done before. She spoke to him not as a nurse to a patient, but as one person to another. "I don't know if you can hear me, mister," Sophie said softly, "but I want you to know that I think you must have been someone special. The way some people visit you, like that older lady today and the woman this afternoon, they came because they care about you. Not everyone has that. Some of my patients die alone with no one who cares enough to visit." She adjusted his blankets and checked his IV one more time. "Your children, though," she said hesitantly. "I probably shouldn't say this, but they don't seem very nice. They talk on their phones while they're in here like you're not even a person. It makes me sad for you." Sophie gathered her things to leave, then paused at the door. "I hope you can hear me, mister, and I hope you know that some people do care about you for who you are, not what you have. That matters. It means your life meant something beyond money and success." As the door closed behind her and Harold was left alone with the darkness and the beeping machines, he made a decision. He would fight, he would recover, and when he did, he would make changes that would shock everyone who thought they knew him. His children wanted his money, they would get something very different than they expected, and Sophie and even Elizabeth had shown him more genuine care than his own blood. That meant something. That meant everything. Harold closed his eyes, truly this time, and began to plan. The old billionaire had been pretending to sleep, and what he had learned while lying silently in his hospital bed had changed everything. Now he just needed to wake up and show them all exactly what that meant. The morning sun filtered through the hospital room windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Harold had spent the night drifting in and out of genuine sleep, his mind working even in his dreams, processing everything he had learned about the people in his life. When the door opened at 6 in the morning, he expected the day shift nurse, but instead, he heard familiar footsteps that made his heart sink. Richard had returned, and this time he wasn't alone. Harold could hear 2 voices, his son's and another man's. Through his barely open eyelids, Harold recognized James, his company's chief financial officer. James was a capable man in his early 50s, someone Harold had mentored and promoted over the years. Seeing him here with Richard at this hour told Harold everything he needed to know about where James's loyalties truly lay. "The old man can't hear anything," Richard said dismissively, pulling up a chair. "The doctors confirmed it yesterday. He's basically a vegetable at this point. They're just keeping him comfortable until the end." That was a lie, and Harold knew it. The doctors had said no such thing. They had said he was stable, that his brain activity was good, that recovery was possible with time. But Richard was rewriting reality to suit his narrative. "Are you sure about this?" James asked, his voice uncertain. "If he wakes up and finds out what we've done." "He's not waking up," Richard interrupted sharply. "And even if by some miracle he did, he'd be too weak to do anything about it. Look at him, James, he's finished. The Empire needs new leadership, and I'm going to provide it." James moved closer to the bed, and Harold could feel the man's eyes on him. There was a long pause before James spoke again. "He was good to me, Richard. He gave me opportunities when others wouldn't. Are we really going to do this while he's lying here helpless?" "Sentiment doesn't build empires," Richard replied coldly. "My father taught me that, actually. Business is business. You're either willing to do what needs to be done or you're not. If you're having doubts, perhaps I should find someone else to be CFO when I take over." The threat was clear, and Harold heard James sigh in resignation. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to start quietly shifting assets," Richard explained, his voice taking on the tone of someone laying out a business strategy. "Nothing obvious, nothing that would trigger alerts. But I want certain key holdings moved into positions where I can access them quickly once I have controlling interest. We'll say it's standard portfolio rebalancing. That's fraud, Richard, James said, though his voice lacked conviction. If the board finds out, the board will fall in line once they see I'm in charge, Richard said confidently. Half of them already support me. They know the company needs younger leadership. My father's way of doing business is outdated, too conservative, too focused on long-term stability instead of maximum profit. When I'm in charge, we're going to make some aggressive moves that will triple our stock price within a year. Harold felt his blood pressure rising. The machines beside his bed beeped slightly faster, but Richard and James were too engrossed in their conversation to notice. "What about your sister and brother?" James asked. "Don't they get a say in this?" Richard laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. "Is too busy with that worthless husband of hers to pay attention to business. She'll be happy as long as she gets her trust fund. David doesn't care about anything except his toys and his parties. I'll throw them enough money to keep them quiet, and they'll stay out of my way. And if they don't, then they'll learn what happens when you oppose me," Richard said, his voice turning cold. "I've been preparing for this my entire life, James. Everything I've done, every move I've made, has been building toward the moment I take control of what should have been mine years ago. My father held on too long, became too sentimental, too soft. Under my leadership, Industries is going to become the most ruthless, efficient, profitable corporation in our sector. And anyone who gets in my way, family or not, will be crushed." The casual cruelty in Richard's voice made Harold's chest ache. This was his eldest son, the boy he had taken to his first board meeting, the young man he had groomed to potentially succeed him one day. But Harold had always imagined that succession happening through collaboration and planning, not through this cold betrayal. "There's something else you should know," James said hesitantly. "Has been asking questions. She's been calling board members, talking to senior executives. She's retired, so she has no official standing, but people respect her. If she starts making noise about improper succession—" "Is a sentimental old woman living in the past," Richard interrupted dismissively. "She has no power, no leverage. Let her ask her questions. No one is going to choose a retired secretary over the founder's son." "She was more than just a secretary, Richard. She was your father's right hand for almost 40 years. She knows where all the bodies are buried, so to speak." "Then we make sure she stays quiet," Richard said flatly. "Offer her money. She's old, probably worried about her retirement. Everyone has a price." "I don't think is motivated by money," James said doubtfully. "Everyone is motivated by money, James. Everyone. You just have to find the right amount. If she won't take a bribe, we'll find another way to neutralize her. I'm not letting one nostalgic old woman derail everything I've worked for." Harold wanted to scream, to sit up and tell his son exactly what he thought of him. But he remained still, breathing slowly, gathering information. Knowledge was power, and right now, information was the only weapon he had. Richard and James talked for another 20 minutes, discussing details of their plan to essentially steal Harold's empire from under him. When they finally left, Harold felt exhausted, not from his physical condition, but from the emotional weight of what he had heard. His son wasn't just greedy. He was calculating, ruthless, and completely devoid of any genuine feeling for his father. An hour later, Sophie came in for her morning rounds. She seemed surprised to find Harold's heart rate elevated and his blood pressure higher than usual. "Mister, your vitals are all over the place this morning," she said with concern, checking the monitors. "Did you have a difficult night?" If only she knew, Harold thought. Sophie went about her work with her usual gentle efficiency, talking to him about the weather, about a book she was reading, about her plans for the weekend. Her kindness was like cool water on a burn, soothing the anger and hurt that Richard's visit had inflicted. "I have to tell you something, mister," Sophie said as she was finishing up. "I probably shouldn't, but I feel like you'd want to know. That man who was here this morning with your son, he left some papers in the hallway. I saw them when I was making my rounds. They were documents about transferring company assets. I didn't read them closely because it's none of my business, but I thought you should know. Well, I thought you should know if you can hear me, which I think you can." Harold's heart rate spiked again, and Sophie noticed immediately. She came closer, studying his face intently. "You can hear me, can't you?" she said softly. "Mister, I don't know how much control you have over your body right now, but if you can hear me and understand me, try to move your right index finger." Harold concentrated with all his might, focusing every ounce of his will on that single finger. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, painfully, his index finger twitched. It was barely noticeable, but Sophie saw it. Her eyes widened. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You're in there, you're aware." She glanced at the door, then back at Harold. "Mister, I'm going to get doctor. He needs to know this. But first, I need to ask you something. Are you in danger? Is someone trying to hurt you? Move your finger once for yes, twice for no." Harold moved his finger once. Yes. Sophie's face paled. "Is it your family? Move once for yes." Harold moved his finger once again. "Okay," Sophie said, her voice shaking slightly. "Okay, I'm going to help you, mister. I'm going to get the doctor, and we're going to figure this out. Just hold on." She rushed out of the room, and Harold lay there feeling a mixture of relief and fear. Relief that someone finally knew he was aware, fear about what might happen next. If Richard found out that Harold was conscious and aware of his plans, would he do something drastic? The cold calculation he had heard in his son's voice suggested Richard was capable of almost anything. Doctor arrived within minutes, along with Sophie and another doctor Harold didn't recognize. They conducted a series of tests, asking Harold to move different fingers, to blink in response to questions. Harold cooperated as much as his limited mobility allowed, and he could see the amazement growing on the doctors' faces. "This is remarkable," Doctor said, making notes on his tablet. "Mister, you've suffered a significant stroke, but your cognitive function appears to be largely intact. You're experiencing locked-in syndrome to a degree, though not completely. With intensive therapy, there's a good chance you could regain substantial function." The other doctor, who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah, a neurologist, conducted more tests. "Mister, I'm going to be direct with you. Recovery is going to be hard. It's going to take months of intensive therapy, and there are no guarantees. But you're aware you're fighting, and that gives you a real chance. Do you want to fight for recovery?" Harold moved his finger emphatically. "Yes." "Good," Doctor said with a smile. "Then we're going to help you. But I have to tell you, this changes everything legally and medically. You're not incompetent. You're aware and capable of making decisions, even if you can't communicate easily yet. We need to document this thoroughly and inform your family." Harold moved his finger twice quickly. "No." Doctor frowned. "You don't want us to tell your family." Harold moved his finger once. Yes, that's what he was saying. "Mister, I understand there might be complicated family dynamics, but they have a right to know about changes in your condition." Sophie stepped forward. Doctor, can I speak with you outside for a moment?" The three of them stepped into the hallway, and though they closed the door, Harold could hear their muffled voices through the thin walls. He couldn't make out specific words, but he heard Sophie's urgent tone, heard her explaining something to the doctors. When they came back in, their expressions had changed. "Mister," Doctor said seriously, "Nurse Sophie has expressed some concerns about your safety and related to your family. We take such concerns very seriously. We're going to document your cognitive awareness, but we're going to be very careful about who has access to that information. We're also going to assign you a patient advocate and involve hospital security in your care plan. If you're in any danger, we'll protect you." Harold felt tears forming in his eyes, and this time he let them fall. These people, virtual strangers, were showing him more care and concern than his own children had. It was heartbreaking and heartwarming at the same time. Doctor pulled up a chair beside his bed. "Mister, we're going to start you on an aggressive rehabilitation program immediately. Physical therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy. It's going to be exhausting and progress will be slow at first. But if you're willing to work, we're willing to help you. Are you in?" Harold moved his finger decisively. "Yes." Over the next several hours, a parade of specialists came through Harold's room. A speech therapist named Karen, who immediately began working with him on controlling his facial muscles and tongue. A physical therapist named who assessed his muscle tone and range of motion. An occupational therapist who talked about eventual goals for independent living. Each of them treated Harold with respect and professionalism, and each of them seemed genuinely invested in his recovery. By late afternoon, Harold was exhausted but energized in a way he hadn't been since his stroke. He had hope now, real hope, that he could recover enough to reclaim his life. And when he did, he had plans. Arrived at her usual time, carrying her thermos and newspaper, she settled into the chair with a sigh, then noticed something different about Harold. She set down her things and leaned forward, studying his face intently. "Harold," she said quietly, "something's changed. You look different today." Harold focused all his concentration on his right hand, which was resting on top of the blanket. Slowly, painfully, he managed to move his index finger up and down several times. His eyes widened. She stood up quickly and came to the bedside, taking his hand in hers. "Harold, can you hear me? If you can, move your finger." Harold moved his finger. "Oh, Harold," breathed, and he saw tears forming in her eyes. "You're in there, you're aware. How long have you been aware?" Harold couldn't answer that question with a finger movement, so he simply squeezed her hand as best he could with his limited strength. Sat down heavily, still holding his hand, looking stunned. "The whole time?" she asked. "Have you been aware the whole time?" Harold moved his finger once. "Then you heard everything," said, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You heard what I said, you heard what your children said." She paused, her face showing a mixture of anger and sadness. "Harold, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry you had to hear the truth about them this way." Harold squeezed her hand again, trying to convey that it wasn't her fault, that he was grateful she had been honest with him. Was quiet for a long moment, thinking. When she spoke again, her voice had taken on the crisp, businesslike tone he remembered from 1,000 board meetings. "All right, Harold, I don't know how much you can communicate, but I need you to listen. Richard is making moves, serious moves. He's been meeting with board members, making promises, forming alliances. He's telling people you're incompetent, that you'll never recover, that the company needs new leadership immediately." Harold's finger moved emphatically, and his heart rate increased on the monitor. I know," said soothingly. "It's infuriating, but Harold, you need to stay calm. Getting upset will only make your recovery harder. What we need is a plan. Can you work with me on developing a plan?" Harold moved his finger once. "Good, now I'm going to ask you some yes or no questions. One movement for yes, two for no. Understood?" One movement. Do the doctors know you're aware? One movement. Have you told your children? Two movements. Do you want to tell them? Two movements, emphatic. Smiled grimly. I thought not. Smart. Let them think you're unconscious while we figure out our next move. Harold, do you trust me to help you? Harold moved his finger once, squeezing her hand at the same time. Then here's what we're going to do, said, leaning in close. You're going to focus on your recovery, work with the therapists, get stronger, regain your ability to communicate. Meanwhile, I'm going to do what I do best. I'm going to gather information, document everything your children are doing, and make sure that when you're ready to act, we have all the ammunition we need. She paused, a steely look entering her eyes. And Harold, when you're ready, when you're strong enough, we're going to make sure your children understand exactly what it means to betray you. They think you're a dying old man they can manipulate and steal from. We're going to show them they're very, very wrong. Harold felt a surge of gratitude so strong it nearly overwhelmed him. Had been his right hand in business for almost 4 decades. Now she was proving to be his right hand in this fight for his life and his legacy. Stayed for another hour, telling Harold about specific things Richard had been doing, people he had been meeting with, promises he had been making. She had been busy, Harold realized. She had been investigating, gathering intelligence, preparing for a battle she knew was coming. All while officially retired and with no obligation to do anything at all. When she finally left, promising to return the next day with more information, Harold felt more like himself than he had in weeks. He had allies, he had a plan, he had hope. That evening, Sophie came for her shift with a small smile on her face. "Good evening, mister," she said cheerfully. "I heard you had a productive day with the therapy team. That's wonderful news." She went about her routine checks, then pulled out her book of poetry. "I think tonight calls for something a bit more triumphant than usual," she said, flipping through the pages. "How about some Whitman? Oh me, oh life, seems appropriate." As Sophie read, Harold listened to the words about life and purpose and meaning. When she finished, she closed the book and looked at him seriously. "Mister, I want you to know something. I've been a nurse for 8 years, and I've seen a lot of patients in situations like yours. Most of them give up. They let themselves slip away because the fight seems too hard. But you're not doing that, you're fighting. And I admire that more than I can say." She stood up to leave, then paused. "I don't know what's going on with your family. I don't know why you don't want them to know you're aware. But I want you to know that whatever you're dealing with, whatever battle you're fighting, I'm on your side. We all are, the whole care team. We're going to help you get through this." After Sophie left, Harold lay in the darkness and thought about everything that had happened. 3 weeks ago, he had been one of the most powerful men in the country. Then a stroke had laid him low, had stripped away his power and left him helpless. His children had shown their true colors, had revealed themselves to be nothing more than greedy vultures waiting for him to die. But in losing everything, Harold had gained something precious. He had discovered who truly cared about him, who owed him nothing but loyalty and friendship. Sophie, who barely knew him but treated him with genuine kindness and respect. Doctor and the therapy team, who saw him not as a billionaire or a powerful E3 weeks had passed since the doctors confirmed Harold's awareness, and the transformation was remarkable. Every day brought small victories. His finger movements had progressed to hand movements. He could now grip objects weakly. He could move his head slightly from side to side. Most importantly, he had begun to regain control over his facial muscles and tongue, which meant speech was becoming possible, though still difficult. Karen, his speech therapist, worked with him twice daily, patiently coaching him through exercises that would have seemed absurdly simple 3 months ago but now represented monumental challenges. Forming words, controlling his breath, coordinating his tongue and lips. It was exhausting work, but Harold pushed himself relentlessly. "Good, mister," Karen encouraged as he managed to form a recognizable word. "That's excellent progress. Let's try another one." The physical therapist was equally demanding. He had Harold doing exercises to rebuild muscle strength, to improve coordination, to regain control over his body. Some days the pain was significant, and Harold's frustration at his limitations was overwhelming. But he kept working, driven by the knowledge that every small improvement brought him closer to reclaiming his life. Visited daily, always at the same time, always with her thermos and her updates. She had become Harold's eyes and ears in the outside world, and what she reported was both infuriating and useful. "Richard held a meeting with the board yesterday," told him on a Tuesday afternoon. "He presented a transition plan. He's claiming you appointed him as acting CEO in the event of your incapacitation, though of course no such document exists. Half the board is buying it because they want to believe it. The other half is skeptical but unwilling to challenge him without proof that he's lying." Harold's jaw clenched, and he managed to form a single word: proof. "Exactly," said with satisfaction. "We need proof of what he's doing, and we need you well enough to act on it. How's the speech therapy going?" Slow, Harold managed, the word taking significant effort. "But steady," countered. "Harold, you've made more progress in 3 weeks than the doctors expected you to make in 3 months. You're going to get through this. We just need time." Time was the one thing Harold wasn't sure he had. Every day that passed gave Richard more opportunity to consolidate power, to make changes that would be difficult to reverse, to poison more minds against the idea of Harold's return. Visited that afternoon, her first visit in over a week. She swept into the room in a cloud of expensive perfume and designer labels, her face showing what Harold recognized as carefully practiced concern. "Oh, Daddy," she said, sitting beside his bed and taking his hand. Harold kept his hand limp, his face slack, his eyes unfocused. He had discussed this with his medical team. They agreed that revealing his recovery to his children prematurely could be dangerous. So Harold continued to play the role of a man barely conscious, even as his mind worked perfectly and his body grew stronger each day. "The doctors say you're stable, but you're not improving," continued, her voice taking on a petulant tone. "Daddy, I need you to either get better or, well, I need this situation resolved. Has this incredible investment opportunity, but my trust fund is locked up until you either recover or until you're gone. It's not fair, Daddy. You're just lying here, not getting better, not getting worse, and meanwhile, my life is on hold." Harold wanted to open his eyes fully, to tell his daughter exactly what he thought of her and her worthless husband. But he remained still, breathing slowly, giving no sign that he heard or understood. Stayed for 15 minutes, most of which she spent on her phone, arguing with about money. When she left, she didn't say goodbye. She simply stood up and walked out, leaving behind only the fatting scent of her perfume and Harold's deep disappointment. David came the next day, clearly hungover, his expensive clothes wrinkled. He slumped in the chair beside Harold's bed and immediately pulled out his phone. "Hey, Dad," he said absently, not even looking at Harold. "Just checking in because Richard said I should. You look the same as last time. Are you ever going to wake up or what?" He spent the next 10 minutes scrolling through his phone, occasionally laughing at something he saw. Then he stood up, stretched, and headed for the door. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at Harold. "You know, Dad, I used to be scared of you when I was a kid. You were always so demanding, so impossible to please. Nothing was ever good enough for you. I'm not scared anymore. You're just a sick old man now. Kind of pathetic, really." After David left, Harold lay in the silence and felt the full weight of his failures as a father. He had given his children everything except what they actually needed: time, attention, genuine love expressed not through money but through presence. Their mother had turned them against him during the divorce, yes, but he had made it easy for her by being absent so often, by prioritizing work over family. But knowing why his children had turned out this way didn't change the reality of what they were now. And it didn't change what he had to do to protect what he had built. Sophie's evening shift brought a welcome change in mood. She had started bringing small things to make Harold's room more pleasant: a plant for the windowsill, a small speaker that played soft classical music, photos of nature scenes that she taped to the walls. "I read somewhere that environment matters for recovery," she explained as she arranged a new set of photos. "Beautiful things to look at, pleasant sounds to hear. It all helps the brain heal." "Thank you," Harold managed to say, the words still requiring effort but becoming clearer each day. Sophie's face lit up. "Mister, your speech is getting so much better. Can you say anything else?" "Kind," Harold said slowly. "You're kind." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, mister, thank you. That means a lot coming from you." She sat beside his bed and told him about her day, about the other patients she was caring for, about her cat who had gotten into her yarn collection and made a huge mess. It was ordinary conversation, the kind of casual chat that most people took for granted, but that Harold had rarely experienced in his adult life. People usually wanted something from him. Sophie just wanted to share her day with someone who would listen. "Can I tell you something?" Sophie asked after a while. "I looked you up online. I know I probably shouldn't have, but I was curious about who you are." Are." She laughed self-consciously. "You built an incredible company, mister. You created thousands of jobs, you pioneered new technologies, you changed entire industries. You should be proud of that." "Was worth it?" Harold asked haltingly, the question requiring significant effort. Sophie thought about that for a moment. "I don't know," she admitted. "Only you can answer that, but I will say this: what you built will outlast you. The question is whether the people you built it for will honor what you created or destroy it. That's not about whether it was worth it, that's about what happens next." Her words stayed with Harold long after she left. What happened next was exactly what he was fighting to control. He wouldn't let Richard tear apart what he had spent his life building. He wouldn't let his children benefit from betraying him. But more than that, he needed to make sure that what he had built went to people who would value it, who would understand the principles that had guided him. The following week brought an unexpected visitor. Harold heard the door open during a time when he usually had no appointments. He kept his eyes closed and his breathing steady, ready to maintain his pretense of semi-consciousness. "Hello, Harold." The voice was male, cultured, and vaguely familiar, though Harold couldn't immediately place it. He heard footsteps approaching the bed, then the scrape of the chair being pulled close. "I don't know if you remember me, Thomas. We served on the Chamber of Commerce board together about 15 years ago. We weren't friends exactly, but we had a mutual respect, I think." Harold did remember. Thomas was another self-made billionaire, though his fortune came from real estate rather than technology and manufacturing. They had indeed shared a mutual respect, though their paths had diverged over the years. "I heard about your stroke," Thomas continued. "I also heard some disturbing rumors about what your son Richard is up to. I thought I should come see for myself how you're really doing." Harold kept still, uncertain where this was going. "Here's the thing, Harold," Thomas said, his voice dropping lower. "I've been where your children are. When my father had his stroke 20 years ago, I saw it as an opportunity. A chance to finally take control of his company, to do things my way. I was ruthless about it. I pushed him aside, had him declared incompetent, took everything." There was a long pause. "My father died 6 months later, and I never got to tell him I was sorry, never got to explain that I understood, too late, what he had been trying to teach me. I've lived with that regret every day since." Thomas sighed deeply. "I'm telling you this because I see Richard making the same mistakes I made. I see him so focused on taking power that he doesn't understand what he's destroying in the process. And I see you lying here, and I wonder if you're aware enough to know what's happening and feel the pain of it." Harold felt a single tear slide down his cheek. Thomas saw it and leaned forward. "You can hear me?" he said with certainty. Harold, if you can understand me, I need you to know something. I'm going to help you. Not because we're friends, not because I owe you anything, but because I don't want you to die the way my father did, with nothing resolved, no chance for redemption or reconciliation. And I don't want Richard to live with the same regrets I've carried. Harold opened his eyes fully and looked directly at Thomas. The shock on the other man's face was evident. "You're awake," Thomas breathed. "You're aware, does anyone know?" "Some," Harold managed to say, his voice rough but comprehensible. "But not your children." "No." Thomas leaned back in his chair, processing this information. "Smart. You're gathering information, seeing what they'll do when they think you can't stop them. Harold, that's brilliant and heartbreaking at the same time." "Have to know," Harold said slowly, "who they really are." "And now you know," Thomas said sadly. "The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge?" "Not sure," Harold admitted, "still planning." Thomas pulled out a business card and set it on the bedside table. "When you're ready to act, call me. I have resources, connections, information. I can help you protect what you've built. But Harold, I want you to think about something. Revenge might feel satisfying, but it won't heal the wound of having children who don't love you. I speak from experience on that too." After Thomas left, Harold thought long and hard about what he had said. Revenge. Was that what he was planning, or was he planning something more complicated? Justice, perhaps, consequences, a lesson that needed to be taught. Arrived an hour later and immediately noticed Harold's troubled expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, settling into her chair. "Did something happen?" "Visitor," Harold said. "Thomas." His eyebrows rose. What did he want? Harold explained as best he could with his limited speech and listened intently. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "He's right, you know," she finally said. "Revenge won't fix anything, but Harold, you can't let Richard destroy what you built. You can't let your children get away with this betrayal without consequences. The question is finding the right balance." "Help me," Harold said. "Need plan." Smiled. "I've been working on that. Let me tell you what I've found out." Over the next hour, laid out everything she had discovered. Richard had been embezzling from the company for years, small amounts hidden in complicated transactions that would be difficult to prove without extensive investigation. Husband was under investigation by the SEC for securities fraud. David had gambling debts that totaled over $3 million, debts he had been paying off with money he had stolen from various family accounts he had access to. "Your children aren't just greedy," Harold said bluntly. "They're criminals, and if we can prove what they've done, we can do more than just stop them from taking over the company. We can make sure they face real consequences." Harold absorbed this information, feeling a mix of vindication and sadness. He had known his children were selfish and ungrateful. He hadn't known they were thieves. "Evidence?" he asked. "I'm gathering it," assured him. "Bank records, transaction histories, communications. It's taking time because I'm being careful not to tip them off. But Harold, I have a contact at the FBI who specializes in white-collar crime. When you're ready, we can hand them everything and let justice take its course." Harold nodded slowly. That felt right. Not revenge, but justice. Not cruelty, but consequences. Over the following weeks, Harold's recovery continued to accelerate. He could now speak in short sentences, though his voice was still weak and the effort tired him quickly. He could move his arms and legs, though not with full strength or coordination. He could sit up with assistance, though standing was still beyond him. The therapy team was amazed by his progress. Doctor told him she had never seen someone his age with such determination and focus. Corinne said his speech recovery was unprecedented given the severity of his stroke. Joked that Harold was the most stubborn patient he had ever worked with, and he meant it as a compliment. Through it all, Harold's children remained oblivious. They visited rarely, and when they did, they never stayed long enough to notice the small signs of his recovery. They saw what they wanted to see, a dying old man who would soon be out of their way. Richard continued his machinations, growing bolder as time passed. He had convinced a majority of the board that Harold would never recover, that the company needed permanent new leadership. He had scheduled a board meeting for 3 weeks hence, where he planned to have himself officially appointed CEO. Had successfully accessed a portion of her trust fund by having forged Harold's signature on authorization documents. She was planning an elaborate vacation to celebrate, completely unaware that the forgery had been documented and photographed by an investigator. David had gotten himself banned from 3 different casinos for unpaid markers. He was planning to sell several valuable pieces of art from Harold's private collection to pay off his debts, art that had been in the family for generations. They were all making mistakes, leaving trails, creating evidence. And Harold was watching it all, getting stronger, waiting for the right moment to act. One evening, Sophie came in looking troubled. She did her usual rounds in silence, which was unusual for her. Finally, Harold couldn't stand it anymore. "What's wrong?" he asked, his speech now clear enough to be easily understood. Sophie looked at him, tears in her eyes. "I probably shouldn't tell you this. It's not professional. But mister, I heard your son Richard talking on the phone in the hallway today. He was talking to someone about taking you off life support. He said you were just lingering, that it was time to let you go with dignity." Harold felt his blood run cold. "But I'm not on life support." "I know," Sophie said, her voice breaking. "That's what scared me. He was talking about convincing your doctors that continued treatment was futile, that you should be moved to hospice care and allowed to die naturally. Mister, he's planning to kill you. Maybe not directly, but by denying you the care you need to keep recovering." Harold closed his eyes, absorbing this new betrayal. His son wasn't just trying to steal his company. He was trying to ensure Harold never recovered enough to stop him. The implication was clear. If Harold showed signs of recovery, Richard might do something more direct. "Thank you for telling me," Harold said quietly. "You may have saved my life." Sophie wiped her eyes. "What are you going to do?" "What I have to do," Harold replied. "What I should have done years ago." After Sophie left, Harold lay in the darkness and made his final decision. He had been planning to wait until he was stronger, until he had regained more function. But Richard had forced his hand. It was time to wake up, metaphorically and literally. It was time to show his children exactly what it meant to underestimate Harold. He pressed the call button, and when the night nurse arrived, the morning sun painted Harold's hospital room in shades of gold and amber as Doctor entered with Doctor, and 2 other people Harold didn't recognize. One was a woman in a business suit carrying a briefcase, the other a man in a security uniform who positioned himself near the door. "Mr. Doctor began, his expression serious. "After receiving your message last night, we've taken several precautions. This is Jessica from the hospital's legal department, an officer from hospital security. Given what Nurse Sophie reported about your son's conversation, we're treating this as a potential patient safety issue." Jessica stepped forward, her demeanor professional and calm. "Mister, I want you to understand your rights. You are a competent adult capable of making your own medical decisions. No one, including your children, can override your wishes regarding your care. However, given your concerns about potential interference with your treatment, we're implementing additional security measures." "What kind of measures?" Harold asked, his voice stronger than it had been just days ago. "First, we're restricting access to your medical records," Jessica explained. "Only your direct care team will be able to view or update your file. Second, we're implementing a visitor screening protocol. No one gets in this room without your explicit permission or without being cleared by security. Third, we're documenting everything. Every conversation, every visit, every treatment decision. If anyone attempts to interfere with your care, we'll have a complete record." Officer spoke up, his voice firm and reassuring. "Mister, I'll be stationed on this floor during visiting hours. I've briefed the entire security team about your situation. If anyone threatens you or attempts to coerce you regarding your medical care, they'll be removed from the premises immediately and will file a police report." Harold felt a weight lift from his chest. For weeks, he had felt vulnerable, exposed, at the mercy of his children's schemes. Now he had protection, official protection, which gave him the freedom to focus on what came next. "Thank you," Harold said sincerely. "All of you, I need to ask for one more thing. I need you to help me arrange a meeting. Here in this room tomorrow afternoon. There are people who need to be present, and they need to see for themselves that I'm aware and capable." Doctor nodded. "We can arrange that. Who do you want invited?" Harold provided a list, of course. Thomas, who had offered his help. His attorney, Jonathan Miles, who he hadn't spoken to since before the stroke, but who needed to be brought up to speed. Several key board members from his company, people he trusted to be honest about what Richard had been doing. And finally, surprisingly, he asked for Elizabeth to be invited. "Not my children, Harold. Not yet. They don't know I'm fully aware, and I want to keep it that way a bit longer." Over the next 24 hours, Harold worked harder than ever with his therapy team. Koren pushed him through intensive speech exercises, determined to get his voice as clear as possible for the meeting. Focused on building his strength so he could sit upright in a chair without assistance for an extended period. By the evening, Harold was exhausted but ready. The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock the next afternoon. At 1:30, officer arrived to help prepare the room. Extra chairs were brought in and arranged in a semicircle. A small table was set up where Harold could have water and his medications within easy reach. Doctor would be present to monitor Harold's condition and to serve as medical witnesses to his. At precisely 2 o'clock arrived. She had been informed of the meeting but not its full purpose. When she saw Harold sitting upright in a chair, dressed in a hospital gown but alert and clearly present, her eyes widened. "Harold," she breathed, "look at you." "Hello," Harold said clearly, his voice still rough but perfectly understandable. "Thank you for coming." Crossed the room quickly and took the chair beside him, squeezing his hand tightly. "How long have you been able to speak like this?" "A few days," Harold admitted. "I've been working hard. We have a lot to discuss." Over the next 20 minutes, the others arrived. Jonathan Miles, Harold's attorney, was a sharp-eyed man in his early 60s who had handled Harold's legal affairs for 30 years. His shock at seeing Harold awake and aware was evident, but he quickly shifted into professional mode, taking notes and asking precise questions about Harold's condition and mental state. Thomas arrived next, offering Harold a respectful nod. "I'm glad to see you looking so much better, Harold. I meant what I said during my visit. I'm here to help in any way I can." The board members, 3 trusted executives who had worked with Harold for decades, came together. Sarah Martinez, the chief operating officer, David, the head of research and development, and James Freeman, no relation to James but someone Harold trusted implicitly as the head of international operations. All 3 looked stunned to see Harold not only awake but clearly in control of his faculties. Finally, Elizabeth entered, elegant as always, her expression carefully neutral. When she saw Harold sitting up, clearly aware and waiting, her composure cracked for just a moment, revealing genuine emotion before she collected herself. "Hello, Elizabeth," Harold said warmly. "Thank you for coming." "Harold," Elizabeth replied softly, "I'm so glad to see you looking well. When I received the invitation, I wasn't sure what to expect." Once everyone was seated, Doctor stepped forward. "Ladies, and thank you for coming. I'm Dr. Mr.'s primary physician. I'm here today to formally attest to Mr.'s medical condition and mental. Mr. suffered a significant stroke approximately 2 months ago. However, his cognitive function has remained intact throughout his recovery. He is fully aware, capable of understanding complex information, and qualified to make his own decisions regarding his medical care, his business affairs, and his personal life. Doctor, would you like to add anything?" Doctor nodded. "From a neurological standpoint, Mr. has made remarkable progress. His speech has improved dramatically, his motor function is returning steadily, and his mental acuity is unimpaired. While he still has some physical limitations, there is no medical reason why he cannot resume control of his affairs with appropriate accommodations for his current mobility restrictions." Harold cleared his throat. "Thank you, doctors. Now, I've asked you all here because I need your help, and I need to explain some things that have happened over the past 2 months." For the next hour, Harold told them everything. About pretending to be less aware than he was. About overhearing his children's conversations and plans. About Richard's schemes to take over the companies, fraud, David's theft, and gambling debts. He held nothing back, his voice growing stronger as he spoke, fueled by anger and determination. Occasionally added details from her investigation, presenting documents and evidence she had gathered. Jonathan Miles took copious notes, his expression growing grimmer by the minute. The board members looked shocked, then angry, then resolute. When Harold finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Jonathan Miles spoke up. "Harold, what you're describing is serious criminal activity. Richard's embezzlements, fraud, David's theft, these aren't just family matters. These are felonies. If we pursue this, your children could face prison time." "I know," Harold said quietly, "and I need to decide if that's what I want. That's why I've asked you all here. I need counsel. I need advice. I need people I trust to help me figure out the right path forward." Thomas leaned forward. "Harold, I told you about my own situation with my father. I don't want to see you make decisions based purely on anger that you'll regret later. but I also don't want to see you victimized by your own children. There has to be a middle ground." "What kind of middle ground?" Sarah Martinez asked. "They've been stealing from the company from him, planning to push him out. How do you find middle ground with that?" Elizabeth spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. "The middle ground is consequences that are proportional and that serve a purpose beyond punishment. Harold, what do you want? What outcome would feel right to you?" Harold had been asking himself that question for weeks. What did he want? Justice, certainly, protection for his company and his legacy, but beyond that. "I want them to understand what they've done," Harold said slowly. "I want them to face real consequences, not just get a slap on the wrist. But Elizabeth is right. I don't want pure revenge. I want something that might somehow teach them to be better people. Is that even possible at their age?" "It's possible," Elizabeth said. "But it requires them to actually want to change, to see that they've done wrong. And I'm not sure your children are capable of that kind of self-reflection." David, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Mister, from a business standpoint, we need to act quickly. Richard has been making promises to board members, forming alliances, positioning himself to take over. If we wait too long, the damage he does to company morale and structure could take years to repair." "I agree," Harold said. "Jonathan, here's what I need from you. I need a complete legal assessment of what my children have done and what our options are. Criminal charges, civil suits, removal from any company positions, or trust fund access. I need to know every option." Jonathan nodded. "I'll have a comprehensive report to you within 48 hours. Sarah, David, James," Harold continued, addressing the board members. "I need you to quietly inform other board members that I'm recovering and that I will be resuming my role as chairman. Don't make a big announcement, but make sure people know that any promises Richard has made aren't worth the air they were spoken with. Can you do that?" "Absolutely," Sarah said, and the other two nodded agreement. Harold turned to his longtime assistant. "I need you to continue gathering evidence, but be careful. If Richard suspects we're onto him, he might do something desperate. Can you keep working quietly?" "Of course," said Harold. "I've been doing this for almost 40 years. I know how to be discreet." Harold turned finally to Thomas and Elizabeth. "I'm not sure why I asked you both here, except that you both offered perspectives I needed to hear. Thomas, you showed me that revenge is empty. Elizabeth, you reminded me that there were people in my life who cared about me as a person. I need to remember both those things as I move forward." Thomas smiled. "I'm here if you need me, Harold. Resources, connections, advice, whatever helps." Elizabeth reached over and squeezed Harold's hand. "You're a good man who's been hurt by people you love. Don't let that hurt turn you into someone you're not. Find justice, yes. Protect what you've built, absolutely. But don't lose your humanity in the process." The meeting continued for another hour with detailed discussions about strategy and timeline. By the time everyone left, Harold was exhausted but felt more in control than he had since his stroke. He had allies, he had a plan, and most importantly, he had clarity about what he wanted to achieve. That evening, Sophie came in for her shift and found Harold back in bed, resting but awake. "I heard you had a big meeting today," she said with a smile. "How did it go?" "It went well," Harold said. "Thank you, Sophie, for everything, for being kind when you didn't have to be, for warning me about my son, for reading poetry to me when you thought I couldn't hear. You're a remarkable person." Sophie blushed. "I was just doing my job, mister." "No," Harold said firmly. "You were being human. You were showing compassion to someone who needed it. That's more than a job, that's a calling. You're going to be a wonderful nurse, Sophie. You already are." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. That means more to me than you know. Mister, can I ask you something? What are you going to do about your children?" Harold sighed. "I'm going to do what I have to do to protect myself and what I've built, but I'm also going to try one more time to reach them, to help them understand what they've done and give them a chance to make it right. I'm not optimistic, but I have to try. They're still my children, even if they've forgotten I'm their father." Over the next week, Harold continued his therapy with renewed vigor. His speech became clearer daily. His strength improved to the point where he could stand with assistance and take a few shuffling steps. The therapists were amazed by his progress, attributing it to his determination and focus. Jonathan Miles delivered his legal assessment as promised. It was comprehensive and damning. Richard could face charges for embezzlement, fraud, and corporate malfeasance, and her husband could be charged with forgery and fraud. David could face theft charges and would certainly be in civil court for his unauthorized access to Harold's accounts. The evidence had gathered was substantial enough that prosecution would likely succeed. But Jonathan also presented alternatives: civil resolutions, restitution agreements, trust restructuring that would limit the children's access to funds while providing for basic needs, options that would punish but not destroy, that would teach lessons without ruining lives. Harold spent several days reviewing everything, thinking through the implications, considering what each choice would mean not just for his children but for himself, for the company, for his legacy. And slowly, a plan took shape. 2 weeks after the meeting, Harold was ready to implement the first phase. He called to his room and gave her specific instructions. "I want you to schedule a board meeting for next Friday," Harold said. "All board members required to attend. Tell them it's about the company's future leadership. Richard will assume it's the meeting where he gets appointed CEO. Let him think that." "And what will really happen?" asked, though her smile suggested she already knew. "I'm going to attend," Harold said simply. "In person, in a wheelchair probably, with a nurse and a physical therapist supporting me. But I'm going to be there, and I'm going to show everyone that I'm very much aware and very much in control." Smile widened. "Harold, that's going to be quite a shock for certain people." "That's the idea," Harold agreed. "But that's just the opening move. After the board meeting, I'm going to meet with each of my children individually. I'm going to give them one chance to come clean, to admit what they've done, to show some remorse. If they do, we'll find a way forward that's painful but not destructive. If they don't—" Harold trailed off, his expression hardening. "If they don't," prompted. "Then I'll do what needs to be done to protect myself and everything I've built," Harold said firmly. "I'll pursue every legal option. I'll cut them off completely. I'll make sure they understand that actions have consequences. I gave them life, I gave them opportunities, I gave them everything. They repaid me with betrayal. I can forgive many things, but I won't be a victim to my own children." Nodded solemnly. "I'll make the arrangements. Harold, I know this isn't easy for you. For what it's worth, I think you're handling this with far more grace than they deserve." "Maybe," Harold said. "Or maybe I'm just too stubborn to give up on them completely. We'll see." The day of the board meeting arrived. Harold woke early, working with his therapy team to make sure he was as strong and alert as possible. Karen helped him practice the speech he planned to give, making sure his voice would carry in the boardroom. Helped him practice sitting upright for extended periods without fatigue. Sophie, who had become invested in Harold's recovery and his fight for justice, helped him dress in one of the suits he'd brought from his home. It took time and patience, but finally, Harold looked like himself again. Thinner, older, using a wheelchair, but unmistakably Harold. "You look wonderful, mister," Sophie said, adjusting his tie. "Are you ready for this?" "I've been ready for 2 months," Harold replied. "Let's go show them what happens when you underestimate Harold." The ride to Industries headquarters took 30 minutes. Harold hadn't seen the building since before his stroke, and looking up at the gleaming tower he had built filled him with a complex mix of emotions. Pride in what he had accomplished, anger at those who had tried to steal it, determination to protect it. Met them at the entrance with a security team and a private elevator. They moved through the building quickly, avoiding most employees, heading directly to the executive floor and the main boardroom. "Richard is already inside," informed Harold quietly. "Along with most of the board, he thinks this is his moment of triumph. He has a presentation prepared about his vision for the company's future. He's wearing a new suit that probably cost $10,000. He looks like he already owns the place." Harold smiled grimly. "Good, let him feel confident, let him think he's won. It'll make what comes next all the more memorable." They paused outside the boardroom doors. Harold could hear voices inside, Richard's among them, sounding confident and authoritative. Harold took a deep breath, nodded to, and gestured for her to open the doors. The boardroom fell silent as Harold rolled through the doors in his wheelchair, flanked by doctor and officer. The shock on the faces around the table was immediate and profound. But no face showed more shock than Richard's. His son's expression went from confident to confused to horrified in the space of seconds. "Good afternoon, ladies and," Harold said, his voice clear and strong enough to carry through the room. "I apologize for my absence these past 2 months. As you can see, I've been recovering from some health difficulties. But I'm back now, and I believe we have quite a bit to discuss." Her message to deliver to Dr. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Harold watched as Richard's face went through a spectrum of emotions, shock dissolving into panic, panic hardening into defensive anger. Around the table, board members looked between Harold and Richard, processing what this unexpected development meant. Harold allowed the silence to stretch, letting everyone absorb his presence. Then he gestured to, who wheeled him to the head of the table, to the chair that had been his for 40 years. With some assistance from Doctor, Harold transferred from the wheelchair to his seat, making it clear through his actions that while he might need physical support, his mind and authority were intact. "I believe," Harold said, looking directly at Richard, "that you were about to make a presentation, son. Something about the company's future leadership. Please don't let me interrupt. I'm very curious to hear what you have to say." Richard stood frozen, his prepared notes clutched in his hand. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Finally, he managed to speak, his voice shaking slightly. "Father, I thought you were unable to communicate. The doctors said you might never regain consciousness." "The doctors said no such thing," Harold replied calmly. "But I understand how you might have heard what you wanted to hear rather than what was actually said. Doctor, would you please explain my condition to the board?" Doctor stepped forward. "Mr. suffered a stroke approximately 2 months ago. However, his cognitive function remained intact throughout his illness. While he experienced some physical limitations, he has been aware and capable of understanding his surroundings for the entire time. His recovery has been remarkable, and while he still requires some physical therapy, there is no medical reason he cannot resume his duties as chairman and CEO." Sarah Martinez, the COO, spoke up. "Harold, it's wonderful to see you recovering, but I have to ask, if you've been aware this whole time, why did you let everyone think otherwise? Why the deception?" Harold leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "That's an excellent question, Sarah. The answer is simple. I needed to know the truth about the people in my life, about who cared for Harold the man versus who cared for Harold the billionaire. When you're in a position of power and wealth, everyone tells you what you want to hear. But when you're helpless, when people think you can't hear or understand them, that's when you see who they really are." He looked around the table, making eye contact with each board member in turn. "I learned a great deal over the past 2 months. I learned who my true friends are. I learned who has the company's best interests at heart. And I learned who was willing to betray me the moment they thought I couldn't stop them." Richard found his voice, though it came out defensive and sharp. "Father, I don't know what you think you heard, but I've been working tirelessly to protect the company during your illness. Someone had to step up. Someone had to provide leadership." "Leadership," Harold repeated, the word heavy with irony. "Is that what you call embezzling company funds? Is that what you call meeting with CFO James to discuss shifting assets illegally? Is that what you call spreading rumors that I'm incompetent to speed your takeover?" The color drained from Richard's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." Opened a folder and began distributing copies of documents to the board members. "These are records of unauthorized transactions, email communications, and witness statements documenting Richard's activities over the past 2 months. As you'll see, his claim of working to protect the company is contradicted by evidence of him working to enrich himself at the company's expense." As the board members began reading, their expressions shifted from shock to anger. James Freeman looked up from his documents, his face hard. "Richard, these transfers you authorized from the European division, you told me they were approved by Harold before his stroke. Are you telling me that was a lie?" Richard looked trapped. "I was trying to protect the company's interests. Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made quickly." "Difficult decisions," Harold said, his voice sharp now. "Like convincing my doctors to move me to hospice care so I would die before I could recover enough to stop you. Like discussing with your siblings how to divide my empire before I was even dead." Several board members gasped. David stood up, his face flushed with anger. "Is that true, Richard? Were you actually trying to hasten your father's death?" "No," Richard shouted, then seemed to realize he had lost his composure. He took a breath, trying to regain his polish. "Father is twisting things. He's confused, maybe still affected by the stroke. These accusations are ridiculous." Harold pressed a button on a small device had provided. Richard's voice filled the room, crystal clear, playing from speakers built into the boardroom. "The old man can't hear anything. The doctors confirmed it yesterday. He's basically a vegetable at this point." The recording continued, playing Richard's entire conversation with James, including his plans to shift assets, his dismissal of his siblings, his intention to make the company more ruthless and profit-focused regardless of the human cost. When it ended, the silence was deafening. Richard's face had gone from pale to red, his hands clenched into fists. "You recorded me, while you were lying there pretending to be sick. What kind of twisted game is that?" "The kind that reveals truth," Harold replied coldly. "You came to my hospital room, stood beside my bed, and discussed how to steal my company while I supposedly lay unconscious. You called me a vegetable, Richard, your own father, and you did it without a shred of guilt or hesitation. So yes, I listened. I observed. I gathered evidence, and now everyone in this room knows exactly who you really are." Sarah Martinez spoke up, her voice cutting through the tension. "Harold, what do you want to do? What happens now?" Harold looked around the table, seeing the mixture of anger, disappointment, and curiosity on the faces of people he had worked with for years. "What happens now is that we vote. I'm proposing my immediate return to active duty as chairman and CEO. I'm also proposing the immediate termination of Richard's employment with this company and the removal of any access he has to company funds or accounts. All in favor?" Every hand went up except Richard's. The vote was unanimous. "Richard," Harold said quietly, "you're fired. Security will escort you from the building. You're to have no contact with any industry's employee, and any attempt to access company property or information will be treated as corporate espionage. Do you understand?" Richard looked around the table, searching for support for someone who would defend him. He found none. Finally, his shock transformed into rage. "You can't do this to me. I'm your son. This company should be mine. I've worked here for 30 years. I've earned my place." "You've earned nothing," Harold said, his voice sad but firm. "You've stolen, you've lied, you've betrayed, and worst of all, you wished for your own father's death so you could take what you thought was rightfully yours. You didn't earn your place, Richard. You were given opportunities because you were my son, and you squandered every one of them." Security officers appeared at the door. Richard looked at them, then back at his father, and something in his expression changed. The anger cracked, revealing something raw and painful underneath. "You were never there," Richard said, his voice breaking. "When I was a kid, when I needed a father, you were always at the office, always building your precious empire. Mom said you loved the company more than you loved us, and she was right. So yes, I wanted to take it from you. I wanted to have the one thing you actually cared about." Harold felt those words like a physical blow. There was truth in them, painful truth that he couldn't deny. "You're right," he said quietly. "I wasn't there enough. I prioritized work over family, and that was wrong. I failed you as a father, Richard, but that doesn't excuse what you've become. That doesn't justify theft and betrayal and wishing for my death." "What would you know about what's justified?" Richard shot back. "You built all this, you have everything, and what were we supposed to do? Just wait patiently for you to die so we could have scraps of what should have been ours all along." "You were supposed to build your own lives," Harold replied. "You were supposed to find your own purpose, your own meaning. I gave you every advantage, every opportunity. I paid for the best schools, the best connections. I offered you positions in the company where you could learn and grow. But you wanted everything handed to you without effort, without earning it. That's not my failure, Richard. That's yours." The security officers moved forward, and Richard allowed himself to be escorted toward the door. But he paused at the threshold, looking back at his father. "I hope it was worth it," Richard said bitterly. "All the money, all the power, all the success. I hope it keeps you warm at night when you're alone with your precious empire." After Richard left, the boardroom remained silent for a long moment. Finally, Harold spoke, addressing the board members who remained. "I owe all of you an apology. My family drama has spilled over into company business, and that's unprofessional. But I want you to know that protecting this company, protecting all of you and the thousands of employees who depend on us, that was my priority throughout this entire situation. I will be resuming my duties immediately, though I'll need some accommodations for my physical limitations. Will continue as my executive assistant. And I want to establish a formal succession plan, one that's transparent and based on merit, not family connections." David spoke up. "Harold, no one here blames you for what happened, but I think we all need to understand, what are your plans regarding your other children? And David, are they involved in this situation?" "They are," Harold admitted. "Though their crimes are different from Richard's, I'll be dealing with them separately, but I want to make something clear to all of you. Going forward, no member of my family will have any role in this company unless they genuinely earn it through their own merit and prove their trustworthiness. The days of nepotism at industries are over. The board meeting continued for another 2 hours, covering legitimate business, reviewing financials, discussing strategy. It felt good to Harold to be back in his element, to be using his mind for the work he had built his life around. By the time the meeting adjourned, he was exhausted but satisfied. Wheeled him back to the private elevator. "How do you feel?" she asked quietly. "Like I just climbed a mountain," Harold admitted. "But a necessary mountain. Can you arrange meetings with and David? Separately, I want to give them the same chance I gave Richard. To confess and show remorse. To show me who they really are when faced with consequences," Harold said. "I know what they've done. The question is whether they have any integrity left, any capacity for honesty. I need to know before I decide what to do." His meeting was scheduled for the next day at Harold's home, where he had returned from the hospital that morning. His house felt both familiar and strange after months away. Had arranged for medical equipment to be installed, ramps for his wheelchair, grab bars in the bathrooms. The house that had once reflected his power now reflected his limitations. Arrived precisely on time, dressed impeccably as always, though Harold noticed the designer handbag was new and probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She seemed surprised to find him in his study, sitting in a wheelchair but clearly alert and aware. "Daddy," she said, uncertainty flickering across her face. "I heard you were better, but I didn't realize you were this much better. Why didn't anyone tell me?" "Sit down," Harold said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "We need to talk." Sat, crossing her legs elegantly, her expression shifting to one of careful concern. "Of course, Daddy. I'm so glad you're recovering. It's been so worrying, seeing you in the hospital, not knowing if you'd ever wake up." "Cut the act," Harold said flatly. "I know about the forged authorization for your trust fund. I know you and have been spending money that doesn't belong to you yet. I know about the vacation plans, the shopping sprees, all of it." His face went white. "I don't know what you mean. Who told you these lies?" Harold slid a folder across the desk. "These aren't lies. These are bank records, forged documents with clumsy attempt at copying my signature, witness statements from the bank employees who processed the transactions. You committed fraud, federal fraud. Do you understand the severity of that?" Opened the folder, her hands shaking as she flipped through the pages. When she looked up, tears were streaming down her face. But Harold had seen his daughter's tears too many times before to trust them easily. "Daddy, I can explain. Told me it would be okay, that you'd approve if you were able to. We were just trying to secure our future. The investment opportunity was time-sensitive." "What investment opportunity?" Harold asked, though he already knew from his investigation that there was no legitimate investment, just gambling debts and expensive tastes. Hesitated, and Harold saw the moment she decided to double down on the lie. "Has a friend who's developing a new technology, cryptocurrency mining or blockchain something. I don't really understand it, but said it would triple our investment in 6 months." Harold said sadly, "I had that investment investigated. It doesn't exist. Took the money you fraudulently from your trust and used it to pay off gambling debts, buy a new sports car, and fund his affair with his personal trainer. You didn't know about the affair, did you?" The shock on his face was genuine this time. "What? No, that's not possible. Loves me. We're planning our future together." Harold pulled out another folder, this one containing photos that a private investigator had taken of with a much younger woman. The timestamps clearly showing they were taken during the period when Thought was building their fortune. Looked at the photos and something in her broke. The tears that came now were real, born of hurt and betrayal and dawning realization. "I thought he loved me," she whispered. "Daddy, I really thought he was different from the others. I thought this time it was real." "I know you did," Harold said gently. "I tried to warn you about before my stroke. I had him investigated. I knew what he was, but you wouldn't listen. You called me controlling and said I didn't want you to be happy." "You were right," admitted, her voice breaking. About everything. I'm so stupid, Daddy. I always pick the wrong men. I always believe their lies." Harold watched his daughter cry and felt his heart breaking for her, despite everything she had done. "Why do you think that is? Why do you keep choosing men who use you?" Wiped her eyes, smearing her expensive makeup. "I don't know. Maybe because I think that's all I'm worth. Maybe because you were never around to show me what a good man looks like." Maybe because Mom spent my whole childhood telling me that men only care about money and power, so I should use my looks to get what I can from them while I can. The honesty in her words cut deep. Your mother was wrong, Harold said firmly. And I was wrong to not be more present in your life to counteract what she was teaching you. But you're not a child anymore. You're 48 years old. At some point, you have to take responsibility for your own choices. I know, said miserably. So what happens now? Are you going to have me arrested? Harold was quiet for a long moment. That depends on you. If you're willing to make restitution to end your marriage to enter therapy to address why you keep making these destructive choices, I'm willing to work with you. But this is your last chance. If you betray me again, if you commit fraud again, if you bring another into your life and expect me to clean up the mess, I'm done. Do you understand? Nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. I understand, Daddy. I'm so sorry for everything, for not visiting you more in the hospital, for thinking about your money instead of your health, for being such a disappointment to you. You're not a disappointment, Harold said, though he wondered if that was true. You're someone who's made bad choices and who needs to start making better ones. Can you do that? I'll try, he said. I swear I'll try. After left, Harold sat in his study and thought about his daughter. She was damaged, there was no denying that. Her mother had poisoned her against healthy relationships, and Harold's absence had left a void that unscrupulous men had filled. But unlike Richard, seemed capable of genuine remorse. There was hope for her, maybe. David's meeting was scheduled for the following day. Harold's youngest son arrived late, looking hungover and disheveled despite his expensive clothes. He seemed surprised to find his father awake and alert, but he covered his surprise quickly with casual arrogance. Hey, Dad, David said, dropping into the chair without being invited. Heard you're back among the living. Cool. David, Harold said, we need to discuss your finances. David's casual expression faltered slightly. My finances? What about them? I know about the gambling debts, David. I know about the theft from family accounts. I know you were planning to sell artwork from my private collection without permission. I know everything. David's face flushed. Those accounts have my name on them too. I wasn't stealing. You were stealing, Harold said firmly. Having your name on an account doesn't give you unlimited access, especially when those accounts were set up with specific terms about withdrawals and usage. You violated those terms. You also stole my property to sell it to pay off illegal gambling debts. That's theft, David. Do you understand that? David looked defiant for a moment, then seemed to deflate. Fine, I have a gambling problem. Are you happy? Your perfect youngest son is a degenerate gambler. Add it to the list of ways I've disappointed you. I'm not interested in your self-pity, David, Harold said coldly. I'm interested in whether you're willing to take responsibility for your actions and make changes. What kind of changes? David asked warily. Harold outlined the same basic plan he had offered. Restitution, therapy, strict supervision of any family money, and one final chance to prove he could be a responsible adult. David listened, his expression growing more resentful with each condition. When Harold finished, David stood up. You know what, Dad? Forget it. I don't need your money or your conditions or your disappointment hanging over my head. I'm 42 years old. I don't need a lecture from you about responsibility. You want to cut me off? Fine, cut me off, see if I care. David, Harold said quietly, I'm offering you help. No, you're offering me control disguised as help. That's all you've ever offered any of us. Control. Do things your way, live up to your impossible standards, jump through your hoops. Well, I'm done jumping. I'd rather be broke and free than rich and under your thumb. David headed for the door, and Harold made no move to stop him. At the threshold, David paused and looked back. You know the saddest part, Dad? I don't even like gambling that much. It was just something to do, some way to feel alive, to feel like I was taking risks and making my own choices. But you wouldn't understand that. You had your company to pour yourself into. All we had were trust funds and expectations. After David left, Harold sat alone in his study and felt the full weight of his failures as a father settling on his shoulders. 3 children, and he had lost all 3 of them. Richard to greed and ambition, to poor choices and damaged self-worth. David to resentment and a desperate need to escape his father's shadow. Found him there an hour later, staring out the window at the grounds of his estate. How did it go? She asked gently. Might salvage herself with help, Harold said. David would rather be free than accept conditions. Richard is beyond reach. I've failed them, completely and utterly failed them as a father. Sat down beside him. Harold, you made mistakes. You prioritized work over family. You weren't present enough. But you didn't make your children greedy, dishonest, or irresponsible. They made those choices themselves. At some point, adults have to own their decisions. They were children once, Harold said sadly. Children who needed a father, and I was too busy building an empire to be there for them. Then learn from those mistakes, said firmly. You can't fix the past, Harold, but you can influence the future. Your empire will continue long after you're gone. The question is, what will it stand for? What legacy will you leave beyond money and power? Harold thought about that conversation for days as he continued his physical therapy and gradually resumed control of his company. He thought about it when Jonathan Miles presented him with legal options for dealing with his children's crimes, ranging from full prosecution to private settlements. He thought about it when he reviewed the succession plans that would determine who led industries after he was gone. And slowly, an idea took shape, a way to turn his failures into something meaningful, a way to ensure his legacy was about more than wealth and power. 3 months after his confrontation with his children, Harold called a press conference. He stood at the podium, still using a cane for support but steady and clear-voiced, and made an announcement that shocked the business world. I'm establishing the foundation, he announced. 50% of my personal wealth will be placed in an endowment to fund scholarships for first-generation college students, job training programs for displaced workers, and support for entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds. The foundation will be led by a board of directors that includes Sophie and several other individuals who have shown me the true meaning of integrity and compassion. He paused, looking directly at the cameras. I built my fortune through hard work and opportunity. I'm successful because I was given chances, because I had resources, because I had help along the way. This foundation is my way of giving that same opportunity to others. And I'm announcing this now, while I'm still healthy enough to see it begin, because I've learned that waiting until you're gone to make a difference is waiting too long. The questions from reporters came fast and furious, but Harold answered them all calmly and clearly. Yes, this meant his children would inherit significantly less. Yes, he understood they might not be happy about it. No, he had no regrets about his decision. After the press conference, Harold returned to his home to find an unexpected visitor waiting. Elizabeth sat in his study, looking at the family photos on his desk. That was quite an announcement, she said when he entered. The business world is buzzing. Your children must be furious. Probably, Harold agreed, settling into his chair with the careful movements of someone still recovering. But Elizabeth, I realized something during all of this. I spent my life building wealth and power, but I failed to build the relationships that matter. I failed to build a family that loved me. I can't fix that now. But I can make sure my wealth does some good in the world, helps people who deserve chances I never gave my own children. Elizabeth smiled sadly. Robert and I used to talk about you sometimes. He said you were the most brilliant businessman he knew, but also the loneliest. I told him that was your choice, that you preferred work to people. But I was wrong, wasn't I? You wanted connection. You just didn't know how to build it. No, Harold admitted. I still don't, really, but I'm trying to learn. Sophie, my nurse from the hospital, she's going to be the foundation's program director. She understands people in a way I never did, is going to help structure it. And we're going to create something that matters, something that will outlast me and do more good than my company ever could. That's a worthy legacy, Harold, Elizabeth said. I'm proud of you. Those simple words meant more to Harold than any business accolade ever had. After Elizabeth left, he sat in his study and thought about the journey he had taken over the past 6 months. From powerful CEO to helpless, stroke patient to recovered man with a new purpose. His children had shown him who they really were, and it had broken his heart. But they had also taught him important lessons about what matters and what doesn't, about the difference between success and fulfillment, about the kind of legacy that has real meaning. The old billionaire had pretended to sleep, and what he learned while lying silently in his hospital bed had changed everything. Not just his relationship with his children, not just his company, but his entire understanding of what it meant to live a life of purpose. He couldn't fix the past. He couldn't make his children love him. He couldn't undo the years of absence and the mistakes he had made. But he could move forward. He could build something that mattered. He could use his remaining years to create opportunities for others, to be present for people who valued presence, to make a difference in ways that money alone never could. And in the quiet of his study, surrounded by reminders of his life's work, Harold felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Not power, not success, but peace. The peace that comes from finally understanding what truly matters, even if that understanding came almost too late. First thing in the morning, it was time to stop pretending. It was time to fight back. And Harold had always been very, very good at fighting, but as a human being worth saving. Even Elizabeth, who had moved on with her life decades ago, had shown him more warmth in one visit than his children had in years.